Hey, so I'm not used to being on this side of the camera. I way prefer being on that side, but currently that side of the camera is a built-in cupboard and there's no space for me. It's not so much a how-to as it is how I do it, and I do hope you learn something from it. So my process is very much in the school of the Adobe suite. I'd say love-hate relationship, but it's a full-on hate-hate relationship. Adobe is the worst, but it is what I know. And it is what I use on a day-to-day basis and have to subscribe to monthly for my job. So I have to use Adobe. And you know what? If I'm paying for the whole suite, I'm going to use the whole suite as much as I can. So you'll see my process goes through setting it up on traditional media, going via Illustrator, inDesign, Photoshop, and then using Procreate for the actual illustration because I just prefer the way it works. I borrowed an iPad from my sister a few years ago. She eventually gave me that iPad third hand because it was in such a state, and I used that to illustrate the first few comic chapters until I justified being able to buy my own iPad, which was a demo one on a slight discount. And I'm not saying it's the best and only way to draw comics, I'm just saying it's one that suits my specific workflow really, really well. So I like drawing on an iPad, like drawing on Procreate, like setting up in the Adobe suite because it's what I know. But yeah, I hope you enjoy the walkthrough on this process. It's a little longer than I was expecting. I did not expect a 40-something minute long video, but that's what you're getting today. Yeah, so enjoy. So thumbnailing starts with grabbing my sketchbook and very ratty script, my new favorite clutch pencil and an eraser, and then just basically bouncing around between the script as written, being version technically 6.5 of the script, and a very, very rough thumbnail. And my thumbnails, when I say very rough, are very, very rough. I've seen some beautiful ones that are probably better than my final artwork, and that's just not going to work for me. Mine are very much more how a shot's composed with literal stick figures, and it's looking at the dialogue, the scene as I've written it in the description, and figuring out how best to get them both to fit on the page. And you know what? This is mostly just practice. It's doing it over and over and over and over until you kind of get a sense for how much would fit on a page. It's not something I'm perfect at, definitely. I still find there's some frames once I've started laying out text aren't doing exactly what I want them to do. But you know what? Mistakes just mean you get it better next time. Look at the dialogue, look at who's speaking, get a sense for how much fits in a frame, and just marking out where it fits. Loose, usually definitions actually of like, this is a medium shot, this is just a portrait, this is the character involved. Okay, cool. So this is editing Tim here. I did record the making of process of this specific Illustrator file, only to realize I know nothing about OBS Studio and to render out a piece of footage that was so jumpy. So let's see, this time around it should do a bit better. Let's do something I was supposed to do in the original recording, and that is updating the names of these artboards to reflect the new chapter. And this is very riveting stuff. First thing that's important to notice with this specific Illustrator file is I have these artboards set up at a bit of an odd proportion. If you click on any one of them, you'll see they're 300 by 400 millimeters. I forget what that is in inches, but I will put that up on the screen quick. And the reason that's a bit of a funny aspect ratio is it's an oversized French BD aspect ratio. Because all my favorite comics are European BDs, including the likes of obviously the more popular Asterix and Tintin, and the now obviously very popular Black Sad, amongst a bunch of them that I have in French but not in English. And that's just the page format I prefer to the typical taller and skinnier American aspect ratio for comics. And it's also slightly oversized so that I can draw my art at a higher size and scale it down to, at this case, generally just the webcomic format. But ultimately it would print at a quite high quality and also hide a lot of my crimes from working quite big and scaling it down a little bit. The next most important thing to notice is on my bountiful layer stack here, the bottommost layer is this guideline layer. And this is one based on what you would find typically like sort of pre-printed Bristol boards and stuff. but I have made this work to my weird aspect ratio, in that you'll notice we have an innermost guide being the sort of extent to which your sort of most readable art needs to be. This is the edge of your page. That's sort of this slightly bigger BD size that I'm working at, and your crop. So any art that bleeds off the edge of the page needs to bleed past the edge of this crop. And these measurements, I did research them. Can't tell you for the life of me what they are anymore. These were all ones I found on like an existing Bristol board layout, followed by a couple sort of hard edges of the page that would be an existing printed page that you could purchase. And I added these tick marks based on a few designs I saw, in that we have your leftmost edge, your center, and your rightmost edge. And then between them, these pips represent quarters and thirds. If I'm designing panels, I can work to these pre-existing markers. But at this point, it's kind of down to that I have a bunch of templates built across the range of the comic. So every time I finish a chapter, I would just save this document out as from chapter 1 to chapter 2, work on chapter 2, save as, that becomes chapter 3, and then I would digitally hoard all of my frame layouts from all previous chapters, because now I can basically build any page layout I want, knowing there's some consistency amongst existing panels that I have used. So while these ticks are quite useful still, I don't use them as much as I used to, because I've got so many existing artboards laid out and ready and waiting to go, and to be sort of Frankenstein into a new layout. So having taken all of my sketches from before, I can start working, and I do try to work quite, shall we say, pedantically, in that I will have a page to a layer so that I can lock them off when I want to work on pages adjacent to them, and you're not here trying to fix page 2 and accidentally grabbing page 3 and our guidelines. So I like to have as many layers as possible so that I can lock stuff off and not accidentally edit them. So my layers guides are locked almost all the time, and then I can start building these based on my layouts as drawn in my sketchbook. And you can see I start looking at ones like this, where we can see that this layout is cut down to the thirds. So this is 2/3, this is 1/3, and I quite liked how this layout's set together. It's also sitting on the third border that way, and my gutters all tend to be 5mm, and I'll often drop a 5x5 rectangle to make sure everything's consistent while working. You can also see that the borders are slightly thicker than a standard 1-point stroke. I believe these guys are all at 2-point. So the gutters tend to be 5mm, and the panels like to follow these pips along the tops and sides. More often than not every time. Sometimes there's a special case like here where it's a bit of a weird size because I wanted a lot of room for my masthead, and I had all these little sort of portrait shots of the characters here that didn't need a lot of room because there wasn't a lot of dialogue. So I spent a lot of time getting these layouts in. They're all individual, obviously individual shapes within Illustrator that I can scale to fit within, as you can see, my innermost crop. Once I've set out all my layouts, I start bringing in my script, which has been created in Google Docs. I'll copy paste pieces of script into its own layer up top here, and you'll see why that helps a lot in a moment. And I'm using a Blambot font, which I love to bits because it's available on sort of an indie publishing license. If you click through to it, we will see that it is called Web Letterer BB from Blambot, all developed by Nate Picos, who I also follow on Twitter. His work is astounding, and I'll never be as good a letterer or sound effects onomatopoeia designer as him, but he makes it a little bit easier for hacks like me who are not so good at laying out text. So just a little bit different, makes it stand out just a little bit more than your average comic font, if you go to someone who knows how to design them well. And I'll lay out all the text sort of roughly. This is never really final. Sometimes the text gets edited here, and then sometimes it gets edited again once it hits inDesign. So this is always kind of like a rough pass, just so that when I am in Procreate, I have something to kind of frame around, and I know how much room my bubbles are going to need once I get to the art. So lots of room here for Max to be standing off to the right. Up here, there's going to be sort of graphics here. So this can keep to the bottom left with him standing to the right. And again, that's looking at my thumbnails that I've penciled in really roughly. So what I will do is, if I want to now export these to work in Procreate, because these, both in file name if we look at the artboard name and in layout, become basically the baseline for any art created in Procreate. So I'll shine my text layer, any layers I want, the templates, any sound effects. I've got a big sound effects library, if you can call it that, of sound effects I've used in previous chapters that I'm also hoarding digitally off the edge of the artboard over here. I can use some that are still live text, others that I will have converted into shapes already, which I would normally send to InDesign. And I can come back for these later when I'm actually laying out the art. So they're all stashed down in the corner there. They don't need to be on for now. I want to keep my line art up and my guidelines up, but not my text for now, because when I go and export as there's my previous exports, I can say use artboard, so it'll only look at the edges of each page. It won't try to export everything as one image. And I can name this one, you can see, layouts, chapter 7. When I export these guys out, they look like this. They give me a bunch of PNGs with transparency, with my guidelines in place and my comic borders in place. And I can have this for the whole chapter on a transparent PNG that I'm going to use for Procreate in a minute. But then I also want my dialogue to be on its own guideline. I'll shy everything except my dialogue, and again, file, export, PNG with alpha using artboards. And again, I end up with something that looks like this, which doesn't show up terribly well in Windows 10, but it will show up quite nicely in Procreate on transparency, which is going to be the next step. So this is a relatively quick step, and it's just nice to get a bit of admin out of the way early when in the process. First of all, I'll bring in the layouts of a couple of the pages, because this will create a document at the correct size to work on. I'll then bring in all the pages, just lay them out nice and tidy, rename them to match the file naming convention once again, and this is where my poorly named Illustrator files came back to bite me. And then have all of these ready as documents at the correct size with all the guides in place. And then it's just a matter of actually dragging in the dialogue, which you'll notice snaps to the correct placement, because the original file bounds are the same as the final document. So I'll just bring all the copy in on all the pages, and then that's all ready to go once I come back to draw just now. Cool, so editing Tim back again, because I lost my original 3D footage on this again as well. But yeah, the cool part about having gotten a bit of 3D under my belt before I started doing Revenants as its own comic is I have been using it for my more complex backgrounds, like with a lot of detail going on in them, but also in sort of recurring scenes. So the Revenants bunker is one I spent a lot of time and care getting resolved, because I knew we were going to be spending a lot of time in this place. So I drew a floor plan, I blocked it out to scale as a bit of a habit as someone who's done a bit of 3D for animation. So technically if you drop light sources in here, it would be very accurate. And yeah, I could probably also drop some textures in here, but I didn't want to use the final 3D as is out of engine. I didn't like the way my characters as drawn in their sort of slightly Foster comic style sat in a 3D environment, especially if I didn't do a 3D environment for every single scene. So I prefer to just use the rough wireframe data, even with the wireframes kind of showing a little bit for clarity when it comes to tracing these images. And yeah, tracing them out, making them match the characters a little bit closer, and then spending a lot of time like in a scene like this where there's a mixture of hand-modeled items such as ducting and sort of like the ceiling of concrete panels. The light fixtures are just really quick and dirty models thrown together out of generic polys, but then more sophisticated furniture is coming from sources like Boom Objects, Thingiverse, free 3D models, just a whole bunch of like open source models that I can kind of drop in, make sure the scale's correct, and use them for framing up shots. So you'll see that this bunker is actually quite a big set, because I know we spend a lot of time in here, but it's also would not fly as a 3D animation set, because it is just a travesty in here. This 3D model just serves enough to get by in the sort of effort of making the comic. When I want to export an image from a scene, and From my thumbnail, I have all of my characters sitting around the table here. I've posed the benches or the chairs. I have Emma's one backwards, for instance, Todd's at the very end, and the twins are sitting together while Max stands up front. And we've got like our whiteboards and everything, a proper briefing situation with obviously its own facilities. Often I'll also lock stuff so that I don't grab stuff by accident, so everything's locked off with the exception of my camera, which we can obviously jump to its viewport. And while I'm framing it up, I'll often have camera to view so that I can frame stuff up. Other times, if I am in a bit of a sophisticated scene and I'm having a hard time looking through my camera, posing it exactly right, I'll have a second view. So we can use things like the gizmo to reposition stuff here as well while looking at a display screen. So it's depending on the situation, those are the kind of ways I'll frame up a shot. But the important part, aside from sort of like being able to move the camera, is making sure that what I'm exporting is going to match my Illustrator document, going to match my Procreate document. So if I go to Illustrator, I will go to the frame in question and I will unlock it and grab its properties. It's going to be in millimeters, which isn't the easiest thing to transcribe into Blender, especially because when you're looking at Blender, we are now looking at an output in pixels. Not the end of the world, so long as these pixels roughly correspond to our metric reading here. So this 243.7 millimeters becomes 2437 pixels. It doesn't need to be like print ready, it doesn't have to be high def, it just needs to be enough for me to frame it accurately in the final drawing program. And then also I can sit here and make sure that like my camera is at like a nice comfortable focal length, play around with like how sort of like wide our shots are, and frame it up like this, view and viewport render image, because then I can actually just export this version in wireframe, trace that in Procreate. And when I come back to the scene later, I can change my output to match the new frame, given it'll be something like over here, for instance. I can go to page 2, grab that property, grab this 2437, which should be consistent as a width, but now a slightly lower 110.8 becomes 1108 pixels in Blender, and reframe that for the next shot. Then it'll change this viewport window. I can adjust my camera, aspect ratio, focal length, and again, spit out another render that'll be cool for reference further down the line. So yeah, and then all the art is generated in Procreate. You can see I've already dropped the 3D render in behind my lines and just add a layer above it for inking. It definitely depends, almost kind of how I'm feeling on the day rather than any sort of like artistic inspiration for it. But sometimes I'll like ink a whole background first and then place characters in it, or I'll sketch the characters over the background and ink them all together. It really kind of depends on the day, and actually more often than not, inking a background over 3D is something of a quick win. It gets the page filled out and I'm not staring at a blank screen, and that makes sketching the characters a lot easier later on. So it's a good way to get motivated, fill the page up, have the environment in place, put the characters in after the fact. So once, in this case, 3D environment is traced over, I will put a blank white layer over the top of everything. I find rather than messing with opacity, having a layer in between means that I don't accidentally save that opacity by accident by combining layers. But also, if I've got multiple layers of sketch, you'll see once I'm done with the characters, I'll put another white layer over the top of that. That gives me the flexibility to kind of just put a blanket opacity effect over sort of stuff and draw over it without having this very dark black line out underneath, make it harder to see what I'm doing. And in a scene like this, which is quite complex with a lot of characters doing a lot of interaction with the environment and sitting in sort of styles that suit their character, I'll really want to nail down a very loose sketch first. I don't always go as loose as this, but when I want to have as much going on as this, it actually pays to do a very loose pass, get all the proportions correct, get all the poses correct, and then come in and do this tighter line art over the top, doing costumes and stuff over the skeleton that I did in the first pass over. You'll see also in this recording that I'm using an app called VizRev. It is a paid app. I don't think it's terribly expensive. I think it was a handful of dollars. And it's definitely sort of been worthwhile for me to have an app like that on hand, because I can drop all the art that I've currently created into like a neat grid by chapter, by sort of like animals that I want to look at specifically, and be able to sort of move around through the comic without having to dig through like Dropbox folders and PDF folders. I'd rather be able to have access to all the animals that I need and all the previous comic pages and see, well, okay, I haven't drawn this character for 3 chapters. How did I draw them again? And bounce around between them in that app rather than trying to dig through Procreate files, dig through Dropbox files. I find it a way more efficient way to look back at previous pages as reference and look at new images as reference, new weapons, new characters, new animals, etc. Very useful little piece of software on the iPad. Once the sketch is happy, obviously, just start inking over the top of it. New layer. I've got a couple brushes in a folder in Procreate that are sort of my go-tos, and there's nothing special about them. They're honestly just some default Procreate brushes I've put in a folder together so that I can find them all quickly rather than digging around through, well, here's my pencils, here's my inks, here's my airbrushes. I've just grabbed the sort of 3 brushes I use all the time, thrown them in a folder, and I can access them at any point. And this is something like one of the standard inking brushes. I've just got it set up the way I like. You can see on the brush scale on the left there, it's set up at a size I'm happy with and that's consistent across all the chapters. And yeah, just ink all of this on a new layer over my pencils, and obviously very importantly on a separate layer to my background. Obviously what I'll be doing later is erasing anything where characters are. And this first pass in the inking, I don't do too much line variation. It's usually just roughly the same size brush across the entire page, and once the sort of all the characters are inked, the background is punched out so that they're not having background shine through the art, I will start adding line variation to the artwork. And it's usually along the lines of along the bottoms of edges, along the further sides of edges, and where 2 objects occlude one another. I'll have the thickest lines to show that something is further away from us than something else. So because of the way Procreate records, the inking is obviously a lot of individual strokes and goes by really, really slowly. This obviously takes up a lot of time in the video. So once I get to laying in my flats, things tend to go a little fast. I'll sometimes drag in previous files to get the correct colors. And I've got obviously character reference sheets for their colors. And I just lasso tool flats on their own layer underneath the line art. There are obviously tricks for using line art layers as reference and bucketful tools. I just don't like the way Procreate handles aliasing. If it hits the edge of like line art in a weird way, I'm not always crazy about the result you get and how untidy it is, and the blending of 2 or 3 colors hitting underneath a line sometimes shows up underneath it. So I prefer to lasso tool everything that's going to be a color, fill it all together, and my flats will all be on a layer together, lassoed like that. As a sort of logical thing for my brain, I'll usually work on the furthest objects and then come closer to us. And then I'll do quite a rough lasso tool on the first few things and refine as we get closer and closer to the camera. So these are my character reference sheets. They are super, super basic, as you'll see is the continued trend here. It's usually just a silhouette with the colors that they use and where they're placed. And while I'm looking at the character reference sheets, I'm also looking in VizRev at other versions of the characters having been drawn in the past, because sometimes I'm like, is this reference sheet, I don't know how that works from this angle, have I done this angle somewhere before? So it's bouncing around between the existing reference sheet, which has all the colors baked in, and previous drawings of the characters. And you can see again, working always back to front, but also working down the reference sheet colors so that I don't miss anything. And I'll work sort of in the order that I present the colors on the document, and then just go through the characters one at a time, basically. Once I'm done with reference sheets, it's just a matter of coloring in costumes. Usually looking at reference, trying to find sort of clothes that I don't end up putting all my characters in shirts and jeans and hoodies every day. I try and match to fashion that I think suits the characters, and try to find reference to make sure they're doing something a little different every chapter. They realistically have like a mixed wardrobe, but not a big one. So this is like the third time we've seen Tana this hoodie. It suits him as a character that is in a hoodie that he got at his varsity all the time. Shading, this is another step that takes a while because I tend to almost erase out highlights. Especially in a scene as dark as this, I'll fill the whole scene in the shadow color that I have blocked off in my references, that I'll use the same shade of purple every time, and then erase in highlights. Sometimes it's a bright scene and I'll actually just paint in where there are subtle shadows. And then I'll come in, I'll do light effects and highlights. And unfortunately, again, because of the way Procreate works, it tends to fly through all my texturing and all of my highlights. So yeah, this isn't technically an art tutorial, but if you would like to see something more specific about my actual drawing as opposed to my process as a whole, let me know. Maybe that's something I put on Patreon soon. Cool, so next stop in the Adobe trade, because we can't do anything without Adobe, as it turns out, is bringing my Procreate document into Photoshop. Because I have a full color version of the comic for patrons, I have a black and white free version as well. And I like the kind of stylized halftone effect I've been applying to it. It took me a little while to land on it. So what I will do from here is grab everything from below my line art layer. I try and name stuff, as you can see. Sometimes that just doesn't happen. So everything from below my line art down to flats, I will go into filter and convert for smart filters. I'll make sure I'm on black and white. I'll tap D on the keyboard. I'll go to filter and filter gallery. And you'll see most of my settings are probably already in the right settings here. If I go to halftone pattern, I make it a nice small size 0 contrast, and that'll make my halftone version of the artwork for the free pages. A little bit stylized, a little bit different to just going desaturate this image. Click on OK, it'll apply to everything under the line art. Sometimes we can get away with an image like this, other times the contrast is a little rough because coming from what looked good in the color, not necessarily what looked good in sort of the tone over here. So I'll just go into a brightness contrast, drop the contrast a little bit, sometimes a lot, and boost the brightness ever so slightly for the black and white pages, and save those right out as a PNG, and keep it all at full size for now with transparency, just because I'm going to be dropping it into inDesign just now. So I can hit export, a black and white exports page. Ignore the 2 pages I've done in the time it has taken me to finish this tutorial. So I have a love-hate relationship with inDesign in that it's obviously good at what it does, but it's a bit of a fussy bit of software, especially if I'm just using it as that sort of low-key fashion that I am. The most important part about it is I will have the entire chapter, please ignore the 2 pages that have already been complete and put into the scene, as one document. At the moment they're just laid out as individual pages. There's no facing pages or anything like that because I'm not going to print with this anytime soon. But the entire chapter is laid out in pages and has the bleeds in the properties of this document. So there's my innermost line for my frames again, my outermost line for my bleed, and the size of my document that I created in Illustrator and then drew over in Procreate. So what that means is now I've got a layer stack starting with the full color art at the very bottom, going through the grayscale that I exported for the webcomic hosts, the panels which I created in Illustrator, the speech bubbles which I create here, and the text which I copy in here as well, with sound effects at the very top for the scenes that need them. So the panels are usually what I bring in first. They're literally copy pasted out of Illustrator. You go to the Illustrator document, you select the panels, you hit Control-C, you come here, you hit Control-V and just line them up. They have the page number baked in at the bottom of the crop mark over there, and these vector files can be edited in InDesign. I generally don't unless like something breaks these lines and I have a character go out beyond the borders for any reason. But generally, this layer is locked. I try not to play with it too often. I'll unlock my full color layer of art, go to my exported Photoshop document and drop that in on that layer. And because this blue outermost line represents the size of my document, I can just drag into those bounds and everything will line up. All the guides in the Photoshop document have been hidden and shied off. All of the original comic frames brought out of Illustrator aren't visible. So if I were to turn off panels, this would just be the art with no borders, no guidelines. So the panels are completely created within inDesign. Once I've got the full color art in place, I'll lock him off. I'll bring in my grayscale art, and that's just that PNG from Photoshop. So same business, just drag it between my two blue borders. They've got transparency so that my stamp stays in there, but sometimes I'll just send it to the back of the stack. Just Control Shift square bracket, open square bracket, or you can go arrange, send backward. But at the moment, it's as far back as it's going to go. And then just because I prefer looking at the color art while I'm working, lock it off, hide it, start working on speech bubbles. So we can turn all those layers on. My masthead is already in the document. So you'll see it's on page 1 for once I've commissioned that cover. I can drop my commissioned cover underneath that, and it's already in on the first page here. These are my speech bubble template and sort of tail, which I'll use if I'm just working quickly. And they're just carried over from the previous version of this document for chapter 6, which was from chapter 5. And as you can see, chapter 4, when I really started getting into a rhythm for these. So I'll unlock my text and my speech bubbles. I will look at my Illustrator document, which has the text from before copied into it. And I will bring this guy up here, give him a little room to work with. Go to Illustrator and select this text. And paste it over here. And rinse and repeat. Make a new frame, come back here, copy and paste. So the one powerful thing that inDesign does is I can start making my speech bubbles sort of at a size that I'm happy with. So this particular piece of copy, I think it's a bit wordy. I may just split this up for the sake of composition, but also maybe a bit of ease of reading. So what I like to do is maybe just split them like this. And if I double click in the corner, it snaps them to sort of nice, comfortable framings. Except when I get like an orphan or a widow, try to kind of reframe them till I get something I like. And then double click to snap the borders to match. The nice thing now by having these snapped to the edges of the text is I can bring them to the text box, sort of eyeball roughly the height of the text up and sort of the width of one letter in. Get these boxes to roughly that same sort of proportion. Go to my align tools and just snap both to center when they're both selected. And then I can bring this text box over here, roughly line it up and align. And I know that these two are going to live next to each other because they're both dialogue from Max, and then just roll it out across the rest. Oftentimes this will be also when my last round of edits is applied, sometimes somewhere between the script, putting it in Illustrator, putting it in inDesign. I don't like the way something's worded, or I want to change the way something is approached. This is usually when I'll do my last edit on the text. Do a read through here, make sure it all makes sense before applying it to the page. But yeah, so if I am happy, I will drag these in and start putting them in the scene and seeing how they feel. Very loosely at first, because sometimes these guidelines aren't the easiest to understand. So I will often switch to preview mode and it all becomes a little bit clearer what's going on. And yeah, I'm just playing around with the composition until I am happy with it. I try to design compositions with enough dead space that if I'm putting speech bubbles on, they won't occlude characters or environment stuff too much. And then sometimes I'm just an idiot and it doesn't work out like I planned it. And that's just a matter of now getting to work with what I have now presented myself. And making best of a weird situation. The other important thing obviously is finding a bit of a flow, making sure that our comic panels and our comic bubbles read in such a way that it's off the title, through text in an order that is logical, and then going left to right, top to bottom. So comic bubble placement being quite important. I try to think of that while I'm planning stuff. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I can go grab my tail, which is hiding off the side of the screen here. And again, this is for when I want to work quick. It's one that I've drawn once and I can scale and rotate and get into place. And then if I need something a bit more complex, such as one that directs at max a bit more clearly here, I will quickly draw that in, and we'll see that's all happening on my speech bubbles there. I could lock the text for now, but sometimes if I want to adjust the speech bubble, it's just easier that everything's unlocked. But I can go on my speech bubble there, put my speech bubble, my tail in place, and make sure it looks like the other one. Select it, and I drop the tool to match. So, bit of both. Depending, I can usually just drag this one around across an entire page, and then every once in a while I need something a bit more specific. But with him not actually being on frame for these, I'm going to leave them as is for the specific setting. And the last thing I will do to my speech bubbles, if I'm happy with them in preview mode, having another quick look at them, is now join these shapes together using pathfinding. I'll just grab both my bubble and my tail and hit combine. The one, again, complicated bit with Illustrator versus InDesign is I've got these little squared off corners, and there's something of an homage to Black Sad specifically. I love the way that the speech bubbles are done in the comic. These are done as an effect on the actual speech bubble. So no matter how I scale them, that effect maintains a consistent size. And that's because it's set up here as a 2mm corner on a bevel. The problem is if I want to draw a text box inside one of these and go text fill this place, it starts doing weird things and it starts trying to hug the corners. You can sit there trying to get all your spacing right. It's more of a pain than it's worth. And then also, if you want to then join speech bubble tails, you completely lock off all of these corner things. They're all broken now. If you did it again, you start getting weird artifacting. So you got to kind of know that you're happy before you combine these two. If there's a problem, you just go and you grab a new box and you start again. So not the most flexible of workflows once you got your speech bubbles laid down, but it's not like the hardest thing to repair and bounce back from. If there are any sound effects at this point, they'd go on my topmost layer of the stack, sound effects. Those are those ones I mentioned in Illustrator that came from the previous comics that used onomatopoeia. Not every page needs it, so often the sound effects is the most underutilized layer in this stack. If I'm happy with the page, do another quick read through. 9 times out of 10 it's fine. The 10th time, one of your patrons messages you and goes, "What were you trying to say here? This text is so unclear," and you come back and fix it. But generally, I'll look now, that's page 2. I can go to File and Export. I will go to one of these 2 folders. I have a 150 DPI and a WebRes. 150 is nice for promo stuff without being full print ready file sizes, and WebRes is where I'll upload into all my sort of comic hosts and stuff like that. So for now, the main export will be 150 DPI. I'll go to my full color. I'll use my naming convention from before and export that full color at 150 DPI. And I want to export just number 2 in the stack. Go to my grayscale page and do the same, dropping it into that same folder for grayscale. So the final step before uploading is that I'm just going to convert these down to a resolution required by the webcomic hosts. Safe middle ground based on the multiple servers I use. I'll just go and export these out at 800 pixels across. So Ctrl-Shift-W is the shortcut in Photoshop. Width down to 800 and export to my web host folder, being WebRes over here, and full color. And that's that. All those pages are ready to go up to Webtoons, Tapas, Comic Fury, Patreon, and wherever else I've ended up by the time you've seen this video. Well, cool. I hope you learned something from that. If you didn't, sorry to have wasted so much of your time. Like I say, didn't expect it to get as long as it did. Didn't expect to ramble as much as I did. And then once I started rambling, there wasn't a lot I could cut out without it stopping making sense. So there's a lot of free places to read the comic. You can go to any one of these resources over here. But if you want to support it, throw a couple bucks my way. See color pages, which aren't available for free just yet. See black and white pages a week earlier than everyone else. See the Procreate video files that are generated are available for $5 patrons. And then just some of my rambling outside of other sort of like behind the scenes stuff. Blog posts are available for free through Patreon. And sort of whatever I can think of that's worth putting up there, I put up there, including this video. I uploaded it for Patrons before I put it up on YouTube. So if you enjoyed it, if you want to see more, I don't know, let me know. I don't do a lot of stuff, like I say, this side of the camera. And I also didn't go into a lot of depth in my actual drawing process. So, I mean, if you want to see more of that sort of thing, let me know. Maybe that's something I try to do a little more regularly. I am, after all, drawing literally hundreds of pages for this 20 chapters script, which I did not anticipate. So there will be plenty of quote-unquote